But for our purposes here today, I'm talking about the regulatory process in Virginia that governs the utilities and how they make decisions about how they provide electricity to all of us as their customers. And we all have a role to play in that regulatory process, which I'm going to articulate a little bit through this presentation. So to give you a little bit of background on the energy landscape in Virginia, when I talk about this regulatory process, it really only applies to the large utilities and cooperatives in Virginia. And those are obviously Dominion Virginia Power is the largest utility in the Commonwealth. They provide over 2/3 of the power in the state of Virginia. And Appalachian Power Company is the second largest provider of power. These graphs were a little bit different in color when I saw them earlier today, but hopefully you can see the juxtaposition between Dominion Virginia Power and Appalachian Power Company. So those are our two biggest targets. Those are what we focus on at SCLC through these regulatory proceedings. They provide the bulk of the power. They generate the bulk of the power in Virginia. So if you can move them, then you can really move the entire state. So where does Dominion's power come from? And this chart shows that the bulk of their power is from coal and natural gas. Over 50% of the power that they supply to turn on the lights here today comes from coal and natural gas. And Appalachian Power Company is actually even more weighted in coal. Natural gas supplies a smaller portion of their mix. They're over 80% of their generation comes from coal. Now, why does this matter? We have a utility regulatory system here in the Commonwealth. It was enacted, the regulations were enacted in 2007, and they were actually enacted at the direction of the utilities. They wanted these regulations. Now you may ask yourself, why would these large corporations want to be regulated? Well, it's a good thing. It's a good deal for Dominion. It's a good deal for Appalachian Power Company. And it's what we call internally a regulatory compact. So what that regulatory compact is first, the utility is obligated to provide reliable service to all of the customers in their service territory. They're granted a monopoly. When you go and choose your power supplier, you're told you either have Dominion, you have Appalachian Power Company, maybe you have a municipal utility, maybe you have an electric cooperative. But you don't have choice in the way that you do when you're selecting a cable provider, an internet provider, who you're going to go with for a cell phone plan. These are monopolies. And in exchange for that monopoly status, the State Corporation Commission, which is the regulatory body that oversees the decisions that Dominion and Appalachian Power Company make, they establish rates. And they establish them at a level that allows the utilities to recover their cost of service. So the generation assets, the distribution assets, the transmission lines, all of those things are accompanied in the rates that we pay to the utility. It also includes a rate of return on equity. And here in Virginia, for these large utilities, the historical rate of return on equity exceeds 10%. So most of us have savings accounts that maybe get 2 or 3% return on equity. Dominion gets 10% for every dollar that they spend. More than 10% actually. It's more like 11.5% right now. So it's obviously a good deal for these utilities to be regulated. But we have a voice and we have a say in how the utilities make the decisions that they do. And that is because the utility is required to file plans with the State Corporation Commission for any new generation asset. So any new natural gas facility, coal-fired facility, any investments in energy efficiency, they file those plans with the State Corporation Commission. They're also required to file long-term energy plans. And those long-term energy plans look at their forecast, so our consumption over the next 15 years, how they expect it to grow, and how they plan to meet that growth through various supply-side resources, so natural gas units, maybe renewable resources, demand-side resources, which are energy efficiency programs. And they have to provide that to the State Corporation Commission every 2 years. And that plan is called an integrated resource plan. So I want to talk a little bit about that integrated resource plan because it's a really important piece of the energy planning process, and it's something that is going on right now here in Virginia. The review process, basically the State Corporation Commission receives Dominion and Appalachian Power Company's plan. They filed their 2013 IRP in September. The Commission issued an order for a full evidentiary hearing in the Dominion IRP. We're still awaiting an order in the Appalachian Power Company IRP. But that hearing will take place the end of April. And there are a couple of opportunities for public engagement around that hearing. First, you have an opportunity to present public testimony at the hearing. So there's a formal evidentiary hearing for those who have intervened. The Southern Environmental Law Center is representing a coalition of environmental organizations that include Sierra Club, Appalachian Voices, and Chesapeake Climate Action Network. So we'll be presenting expert testimony, full briefing on these issues. But there is an opportunity for the public to come, and if you're engaged and interested in how Dominion and how Appalachian Power Company are planning to supply power over the next 15 years, you can lend a voice and you can tell the Commission that certain types of resources are more beneficial for the Commonwealth and that Dominion and Appalachian Power should be pursuing that path. So that's one process. The other process is that you can submit written comments to the Commission, and all of that goes into the record. They have to review the comments that public witnesses, public citizens, environmental organizations provide, and they have to analyze those comments, and it goes into the record, and it makes up a very significant body of the review process. So those are two in particular ways that you can get involved in the regulatory process. And for the written comments for Dominion, those are due the middle of April. Appalachian Power Company, like I said, we're still waiting on a timeline for them. They're undergoing a reorganization, and I won't even get into the details of that because it's way more complex than anything that we want to talk about today. So diving in a little bit on Dominion and Appalachian Power Company's resource plans. The present looks a lot like the future. So you see their 2013 plan is heavily weighted in coal and natural gas. By 2028, they'll be even more heavily weighted in coal and natural gas. Natural gas will supply more of their power than coal in 15 years. But if you look at their investments in renewable resources, so in 2013, they're at just about 1%. 15 years from now, they'll be at less than 2%, 1.8%. So over a 15-year period, that's how they expect to meet our energy demands, okay? And Appalachian Power Company is no different. So they are over 80% coal right now. In 15 years, their plans include actually a 1% increase in their electricity production from coal. They're a little bit better than Dominion in renewable resources. They're at about 4% right now. Most of that is from market purchases of wind, land-based wind. In 2028, they're planning on increasing their investments in renewable resources by less than 1%, so just under 5%. Still a very minuscule amount of their resource plans. So why does this matter, and why should this matter to us? We all know that an over-reliance on fossil fuels, an over-reliance on any one type of resource presents a number of risks to us as ratepayers. We're the customers. If Dominion isn't analyzing these things properly, if Appalachian Power isn't analyzing these things properly, then in 15 years they could be stuck with a portfolio that is incredibly expensive. And why could it be expensive? Well, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty over fossil fuel prices when you think about coal extraction, natural gas extraction through hydraulic fracturing. There are certainly a tremendous number of uncertainties associated with these fossil fuel prices. There are a number of uncertainties over carbon regulations and other EPA regulations. So Dominion and Appalachian Power Company, they have to look at how both federal and state implementation of carbon regulations what they'll look like over the next 15 years. And both of them are undervaluing carbon and the impact of that on the cost of providing power over the next 15 years. There's uncertainty over construction costs. So when you're talking about building a tremendous number of new natural gas units that cost over $1 billion a year, you're putting a lot of capital into centralized power stations that could go to more flexible resources like renewable energy, like energy efficiency, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And there's obviously uncertainty over energy forecasts. They're assuming that we will continue to use more and more energy, but our homes are becoming more efficient, our cars are becoming more efficient. We're more cognizant now than we have ever been about our energy use, and that's only going to continue into the future. Dominion's forecasts over the last 10 years have been incredibly overly optimistic, and we anticipate that these energy forecasts will also be overly optimistic. What does that mean? It means if they're anticipating that we're going to be using energy at this level, but we're only using energy at this level, and they construct plants to meet energy at this level, then we have to pay for all of that excess capacity, and that comes back on us as the ratepayers. So there are certainly a tremendous number of risks with an over-reliance on any one type of fuel. And I want to tell you a little bit about this turning point that we are in Virginia right now. And we're seeing it across the entire country. A lot of states are really looking at clean energy resources, and they're taking them into account in their resource planning processes. And you've seen that Dominion and Appalachian Power Company really have not put any weight on those resources. One example is a report that was released earlier this year. It's called it's Changing Course, a Clean Energy Investment Plan for Dominion Virginia Power. And I'm just using that as an illustrative example of how we can meet these energy demands, how we can do so in a realistically achievable way. It's going to be incremental. We know that it's a long process to turn these big ships in a different direction, but there are a tremendous number of benefits of this type of an investment plan. So this report showed that Dominion alone could add over 2,000 megawatts of solar, 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind in 15 years, the full 2,000 megawatt offshore wind lease area that Chelsea will talk about a little bit later by 2030, 360 megawatts of land-based wind, and over 3,000 megawatts of energy efficiency. This would translate to over 15% of their generation portfolio on renewable resources alone. And energy efficiency, it would be another 15% of their generation portfolio. So 30% clean energy resources in the next 15 years. And it would cost between $633 million and $1.78 billion less than Dominion's current plans to build new natural gas units. So there are a tremendous number of opportunities with this plan. And it would reduce reliance on fossil fuels by 15%, not to mention all of the other ancillary benefits like carbon and environmental offsets that are associated with that. So just to give you a little bit of background on energy efficiency itself. So we talked about energy planning. Chelsea's going to talk about offshore wind. Ivy's going to talk about solar. Energy efficiency is kind of the low-hanging fruit. So it's basically doing more with the resources that we already have in our suite of our portfolio. And it was a goal that was mandated by the General Assembly in 2007 that we reduce our consumption by 10%, okay? And the State Corporation Commission found that this 10% reduction goal, which is actually a very modest reduction goal, was achievable. It's cost effective. But as you can see, between Dominion and Appalachian Power Company's plans, Dominion is anticipating that by 2022, they'll be less than half of the way to that goal. And Appalachian Power, less than a quarter of the way to that goal, or just over a quarter of the way to that goal. So they're nowhere near taking energy efficiency into account the way that they should. There's a tremendous potential for energy efficiency in the Commonwealth. And it has the potential over the next 15 years, like I said, to supply 15% of Dominion's load at a lower cost than all of Dominion's traditional resources. So if you look at this blue block, energy efficiency programs range in cost between $20 and $40. This diagram shows $0 to $50. And you look at, it doesn't have a little, there was a little chart. But coal has a much higher cost. Natural gas has a much higher cost. And nuclear is one of the highest cost resources that Dominion has in its fleet. And these are the resources that Dominion is relying on to provide the substantial majority of their energy production. So how can you say that this is the lowest cost plan when there is a tremendous amount of low cost energy efficiency potential that Dominion is just not taking into consideration? Plus there are all of these ancillary benefits of energy efficiency that the utility can take advantage of. Human health, environmental protection, climate change mitigation, all of the things that we talk about as environmentalists every day. So there are a number of policies that we can speak to our legislators about. Certainly the integrated resource planning process. It's part of the regulatory code. Dominion and Appalachian Power Company have to file these integrated resource plans with the commission, but the legislatures should also have a say, and they should provide comments to the commission. We should all provide comments to the commission, and we should really inform the legislatures about why it is important for Dominion and Appalachian Power Company to take clean energy resources seriously in their IRPs. If they don't plan for them in their IRPs, then we're not going to see them in the future. There's certainly support that we can provide for approval of energy efficiency programs. So Dominion has applied for a third round of efficiency programs at the State Corporation Commission. Appalachian Power Company has 0 utility scale energy efficiency programs. We've been told that they are planning on applying for them in the spring of this year. So those are things that we can continue to advocate, that our legislators push for these utilities to make incrementally higher investments in energy efficiency. Creating financial incentives for utilities to invest in energy efficiency. We've seen that this is the #1 way in other states that the utilities have made these investments. In our neighboring state, North Carolina, the largest utility, Duke, is required to invest in energy efficiency at the level that we put forth in our Clean Energy Investment Plan. And the reason that they've agreed to it and actually supported it is because there are economic incentives for them to pursue these efficiency plans. And it's a good thing for ratepayers at the end of the day because it's a low-cost resource. And the final way that we can really move in the right direction toward energy efficiency is developing a comprehensive energy efficiency plan and putting this 10% goal, to the side and making a mandatory energy efficiency requirement. So that's something that we'll be working on. It's certainly not something that we'll see in this session. It's probably going to be a multi-year effort, but it's definitely going to be a big piece of our work over the coming 3 to 4 years with the new administration. So that is my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I know that it wasn't the most exciting, but energy is one of those areas that really does impact all of us, and it's important for us to have this type of discussion here today.
About the Renewable Portfolio Standard and offshore wind. So the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, which is the acronym that those of us working on this use, is it's a statute that is used in states across the country. It can be voluntary, like it is here in Virginia, or it can be mandatory, which it is in many other states that actually have this type of statute. And what it is that it requires utilities to use a certain amount of the electricity that they generate to come from renewable sources. Some states have very strong policies where they're specific in emphasizing clean renewable energy that's non-emitting. And some states have pretty inclusive statutes, which, for example, in West Virginia, they actually include burning tires, and in Pennsylvania, they include valve tiles, which is a byproduct of coal. So I'd actually say that Virginia falls in the middle. We do include wind and geothermal and solar and all the good ones that we all support, but it also includes landfill gas, municipal solid waste, and animal waste. So it's kind of in the middle, could be better, but definitely not one of the worst that's on the books. The problem with ours is that it is a voluntary standard. It's not mandatory, so the utilities do not necessarily have to participate in the program. And the other problem is that, well, actually there are a lot of problems, but the two specific problems are that it's voluntary and then it's a really weak standard. It's only 15% by 2025. It originally was 15% by 2022. They were able to get it extended by 3 years, but we'd like to see that as a higher percentage. Ultimately, our goal would be to have a mandatory standard. We'd like to make sure that the utilities must comply with generating renewables, especially after hearing what Angela told us. We kind of need to hold their feet to the fire. They're really not doing what we'd like to see them do. But as I like to say, if we were to wave a magic wand tomorrow to make our statute mandatory, it's a pretty terrible law, and there are a lot of things that need to be changed. Because right now, the utilities are using the system, they're gaming the system to use the least cost without actually building anything here in the state. So because I don't have a presentation, I just want to show you, if you turn to page 14 in the briefing book, I have some graphs for you. This is specifically on Dominion Virginia Power and how they're meeting the RPS. And if you see the first one, 100% of the renewable energy credits that they are purchasing are coming from hydro. They are using some in-state generation, which is also hydro, and they're using one biomass plant. It's 83 megawatts, so it's a really tiny amount. But 100% of the RECs that they are purchasing are hydro, and over 70% of those RECs are coming from hydro plants that were built before World War II. So they, and this has actually gotten worse. This comes from their 2012 compliance report that they had to release back on November 1st. The compliance report, if you compare that to the one the year before, they actually used some other things, some things we don't like, such as municipal solid waste. they were a little more diverse, if you would say, last year than they were for this year, because now they're using all hydro. So it's gotten worse, and the problem is they aren't using any renewables from any generating facility since 1989. So they were all of the facilities that they're using, that they're purchasing renewable energy credits from, were built pre-1989. The biomass plant that they use, that they're actually using the generation from that plant, and that's one they own, it's here in Virginia, it was built in 1994. So 100% of the facilities that they use to meet the RPS were not built this century. So the problem is that the bill that created this program was enacted in 2007, and the purpose was to incentivize renewables in Virginia. The problem is, clearly, it's not incentivizing new renewables because nothing that's been built since 2007 is even being used. And most of it isn't even coming from Virginia. So there are a lot of issues with this bill that we want to work on, that we need to work on. Because if we ended up mandating what's on the books now, we would just be mandating that they could continue to use renewable energy credits from hydro plants from Pennsylvania and Maryland that were built before World War II. So we need to have strong reform, and we need to fix some of these bigger issues before we can push for a mandatory, which again is our ultimate goal. So we have two different patrons for RPS bills that are going to be coming up in 2014. Senator McEachin will be carrying an RPS bill for us in the Senate, and Delegate Lopez will be carrying a bill for us in the House. And we're still working out details. Delegate Lopez convened stakeholders over the last year. Both of them carried the same bill for us last year. And so he over the summer and through the fall, convened stakeholders, including the utilities, the solar industry, and some of the other alternative renewable energy industries, that we could figure out where we have common grounds. And so two of the main points of that bill, and these are small reform pieces. Again, this is not something that if we were able to pass, we're not going to be throwing a ticker tape parade in the streets. But it is reform that is needed. One of the biggest issues is they are allowed to, they have limitless banking. And what that means is that they can buy a renewable energy credit in 2013, they can hold on to it, and then use it to apply it to the RPS in 2022. So we want to limit banking. Most states that have an RPS statute say that they limit it to 2 to 3 years. So our law would limit it to 3 years. If you purchase the renewable energy credit in 2013, you have to apply it before 2016. So it's just common sense. It's a small piece, but it's something that we do need to work on, and one of the small pieces of reform that we can get everyone on board with. So that's one of the small pieces that we're tackling. We're also looking at a way to limit the number of RECs they can purchase. We are getting pushback from the utilities, obviously, on this particular piece, but obviously it's needed. If most of the renewable energy that they're applying to this program is coming from out-of-state RECs, then we need to do something about that. We need to be able to limit that. So that will be in the bill, but right now we're not sure what that's going to look like. So we'll keep you posted. Obviously, we'll know more by lobby day, and we'll let you know how that's moving forward. But we are continuing to talk with all of the stakeholders and see where we can find common ground on that particular piece. So that's the RPS piece, and obviously with RPS, with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the purpose is to get steel in the ground. So, and more so for renewables that we support, which we consider called the non-emitting renewables: wind, solar, geothermal, hydro. Particularly for us, we support all of those things, but wind and solar are the two most important. And Ivy will be talking about the plethora, I'd say, of solar legislation that we're going to be working on, and that we have worked on and will be working on. But I wanted to focus on offshore winds. So this past year has actually been really exciting for offshore winds. We had the second ever lease being held in the country. It was held off the coast of Virginia for an area that will be about 2,000 megawatts. It can produce about 2,000 megawatts of clean renewable energy. So there was an auction process. The federal government was in control of that federal process through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And Dominion Virginia Power did win. They did have a competitor, which we were pretty happy to see that Apex Wind competed against them for the lease blocks, but Dominion did ultimately win the lease blocks. The lease has been signed and the clock is ticking. A lot of our concerns were that they were going to take up the lease, win the lease, and then just sit on it and do nothing. So a lot of us had talked with the BOEM officials, and I think that they calmed some of our fears in that they have specific measures in place. And so within 6 months, the site assessment plan needs to be submitted. Within a year, the construction and operation plan needs to be submitted. So there are steps along the way that they have to hit. And if they don't, then BOEM's going to come in to find out what's going on. So it is still possible that they will hold this up and just sit on it for 5 years and then say it's too expensive. They have not, in all of their press releases, in the IRP planning, they are not saying rah wins. They're saying, well, we'll build it if the costs come down. So that is something to be aware of, that they have won the lease, but they don't seem to be that as thrilled about it as we do. And then just to mention that in the latest IRP, the offshore wind isn't even mentioned. So the fact is they won the lease, but they don't even include it in the energy planning. So that just goes to show you, yeah. I mean, their argument is, well, the IRP came out before we won the lease, but it could have been at least included in one of the alternative scenarios. So it'll be interesting to see if it's included next year. We don't have any specific legislation on offshore wind this year. There has been talks about providing it, making it so that it's within the public interest. This would help the process, the approval process through the State Corporation Commission. But Dominion has said that they want to hold off. I'm running out of time, but they have a pilot program that they are doing through DOE, and in May of next year, they will find out whether or not they've won the pilot program. There are 7 projects total. 1 dropped out, so it's down to 6, and they're the only one in the southeast, and they're the only project that's right next to a wind energy area. So we feel strongly that they will move forward, and this is a project they do want to build. It's 12 megawatts, 2 turbines. It's a test project. They have a lot of great partners. They're teaming up with Alstom. They're teaming up with the state. And so if they do win the DOE grant, we know that that project will move forward. But the concern is that the SCC, the State Corporation Commission, may not approve it. So we will need to see legislation to help that project along. But I don't think that's going to happen in 2014. We'll probably see that in 2015.
The solar industry is so small that we're still kind of getting our act together, and I say us because I have been working closely with them for the last couple of years. I was looking around the room and counted at least 5 people that I know who have solar here. How many do have solar panels at your house? Yeah, and this is, I mean, you guys are a significant percentage of Virginia's solar. Virginia has about 10 megawatts of solar, which comes out to about 1,000 houses worth. We've got something like 1/30 of what Maryland has, 1/100th of New Jersey. I mean, we're way behind other states, and it has to do. There are a number of factors involved, including the fact that we have relatively low utility prices here, but we also have no incentives. And we have these vertically integrated utilities that Angela was telling us about. They are hostile to solar. They do not want their customers generating their own electricity. It takes money out of their pockets. So they have been fighting tooth and nail against the kinds of policies and the kinds of legislation that would enable more people to put solar on. The good news is that the solar industry has really started to focus on Virginia. They're determined to make headway. And we have had an extraordinary amount of meetings with them. We've had a solar collaborative since last spring that has been a combination of the environmental groups and the solar industry and a few other players to talk about how do we have a common agenda. And then we've had a larger group facilitated by the Department of Environmental Quality that includes the utilities. And initially our hope was that we could come to some consensus on things that we could take to the legislature and wouldn't, and we could say we can all agree on these small bits. It turns out we're really not going to have much that we could go to and say we all agree. We've been given a heads up. The utilities will oppose basically anything that makes it easier for their customers to compete with them, is how they put it. So that, and that, I mean, this is what we face. So when we're looking at legislation, we've got two sets of problems. One is that we've got utilities. Dominion Power is the largest non-party donor to political campaigns in Virginia. They have tremendous influence on the legislature. Not on everybody, but enough key players on the key committees that it is almost impossible to get legislation passed that they oppose. Then there is, the question that we have, there is a lot of suspicion of renewable energy among the more right-wing part of the Republican Party, and I want to distinguish, we do have Republican supporters for solar, so this is not a blanket statement, but there are a lot of people who kind of come from the Americans for Prosperity wing of the party, and they are hostile to the very idea of renewable energy, and they're very hostile to anything that looks like subsidies. And when we're talking about incentives, in that is also another way of saying a subsidy. So you've got on the one hand the difficulty of opposition from the utilities. On the other hand, you've got people who are very skeptical of anything that looks like subsidies. Where the opportunity is in the legislature is that there's also an awful lot of people who don't like monopolies pushing their weight around, who do believe that people should have the right to generate their own electricity, who believe in small businesses, who've got these small installers in their districts, and the installers are getting savvy enough to start talking to their legislators and say, I've created jobs here. So there is some sympathy there for that position, and that does open some opportunities there. So with that kind of, and I should go back also one thing that we've become aware of this fall. How many of you are aware of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council? Okay, everybody's pretty savvy on that one. It's a group of it's
reactionary.
Yeah, I mean, it's right-wing dominated group that masquerades as being helpful to legislators in coming up with good legislation in the public interest. And what it really is ways to promote a right-wing agenda. Dominion Power is a member of ALEC, and ALEC has taken a very strong stance in recent years against renewable portfolio standards. They have been trying to gut them across the country. This year they are making a push against solar specifically and distributed generation by supporting standby charges, which basically charge you for power you're not using because you might have to use power. You're taking advantage of the grid, and even though you are performing a service to the grid by producing energy at peak time when it's very expensive, they say that you're not paying your fair share of the cost, and that's unfair to everybody else. This is the first time you've ever heard about utilities being really concerned about their poor ratepayers, on, you know, and how hard this is on people. You don't hear this when they're doing their rate structure, in which basically the people who use the least are subsidizing the people who use the most. You don't hear about ratepayer fairness in that scenario. But all of a sudden, this is a big topic. People must pay their fair share. So we've now got that to contend with as well. It's not just about us, but it's now about ALEC's agenda nationwide, and them seeing Virginia as a wedge state because of the power of our utilities. You know, if they can do it here, they can set precedents elsewhere. So we're not. So the solar industry has a big wish list, but we're up against the kind of opposition that makes it difficult to get much past. Is that my 2 minutes? Good. The renewable portfolio standard that we're talking about, these reforms would do nothing for the solar industry because there again, the utilities aren't going to get on board with anything. So the solar industry has a bill of its own that they'd like to get that would have a solar carve-out within the voluntary RPS. They know we're not going to get a mandatory one with the legislature as it is now. They would like tax credits. That's going to be a big push this year for them, is a tax credits kind of modeled on the land conservation tax credits that you could get as much as 40% back in the tax credit for your installation. They'd like to address an issue of a local taxation of solar equipment as machinery and tools. I won't go into that, but I can tell you more about it if you're really as wonky as I am on this stuff. And then there's trying to expand net metering to include community net metering, of being able to take advantage of somebody else's system, to cooperate in putting up a system so that those of us who have shady roofs can still be doing solar. The problem with anything that expands net metering is that we suspect that the quid pro quo will be standby charges, and that's where this battle is going to take place there, is that the utility will attempt to put that in. We know that they are looking to do this. We're going to be playing significant defense on standby charges. That may be where we see the battle first.